Event. Okay. Good morning, everybody. This is an event, a dialogue, an interview through the Center for Future Consciousness. And what we're doing today is the nature and future of consciousness. Tom Lombardo, that's me on the left, is going to be interviewing Dr. Alan Leslie Combs. And briefly, I wanted to explain how this interview came to be. I've been working on a book, The Future Evolution of Consciousness. The chapters that have been finished are up on my website, the Center for Future Consciousness. And I had been planning on starting a webinar series. And I have the dates up there for the first two webinars. February the 8th is the first date, and the second one will be February 22nd. And I thought it would be really a valuable thing to interview my dear good friend who's been involved in the study of consciousness for however many decades, multiple decades, Dr. Leslie Allen Combs, Alan Leslie Combs. And so I just wanted to mention that there will be this webinar series that will be starting up within a few weeks. And that webinar series and the book that I'm working on is what instigated me to get in touch with Leslie and ask him if he would like to do an interview. And Leslie said, well, why don't we make the interview that we do open to the public? And so that's what we're doing today, which is me interviewing Leslie on his views on consciousness. Now, at this point, I wanted to give Leslie an opportunity to introduce himself. And I have up here a slide showing a number of his important books, as well as his two main affiliations, the Society of Consciousness for Consciousness Studies and the California Institute of Integral Studies. So at this point, I just want to turn it over to Leslie so he can introduce himself, and then we'll move forward from there. So go ahead, Leslie.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? And is the screen okay? Because I'm looking at a different screen where I have an outline of my talk, whatever I say. So I just want to make sure that you're not looking at that, or you're welcome to. Anyway, here's a brief introduction. I'm just going to read this. I don't know where I got it, somewhere online. Alan Combs, PhD, is a professor emeritus, consciousness researcher, neuropsychologist, and systems theorist at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and also at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. I'm actually faculty emeritus at two institutions, and is the founder of and past president of the International Society of Consciousness Studies. I don't mention it here, but it goes back so far back in time that I used to teach at Saybrook as well. So we could have put Saybrook University here in my background, although I hold no position there, emeritus or anything like that. So that's pretty much where one of them is that I'm working with friends and my wife here in Cuenca, Ecuador, with one of the universities to create a conference on consciousness in the brain this coming fall. And that hasn't been officially announced yet, but we have a few people that have already agreed to speak, like Stanley Krippner's one of them, Alex Gomez from Spain, and one or two others. Sharon. I always have difficulty pronouncing her last name, but actually she's the keynote speaker. So we're just putting this together, and if you're interested in online or actually coming to Cuenca here in the Andes in the fall for this conference, get in touch. Okay, that's my intro, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. So, what I wanted to just put up on the screen to begin with is the outline for today. And like I had mentioned, Terry mentioned too, it's up there on the chat room if you want to go ahead and download it. After our introductions, which we have gone through, the series of questions I'm going to ask Leslie are: what is and what isn't consciousness? And what are his thoughts on the historical evolution of consciousness? And since he has worked together rather closely with Ken Wilber, Leslie's views on Wilber's ideas on consciousness. And then finally, what Leslie has concluded from all of his research and thinking on the nature of consciousness. At that point, we'll have a 10-15 minute break. And then we'll move into the second half, which will be structured in terms of a set of general categories of theories of consciousness that are outlined in Robert Lawrence Kuhn's recent giant article on the landscape of the study of consciousness and theories of consciousness. And some of the questions I will ask Leslie, inspired by that article, include: is there a hard problem of consciousness? And what are Leslie's thoughts on materialism, dualism, emergence, identity theory, idealism, monism, panpsychism, evolutionary views of consciousness, computational AI thinking on consciousness, psi studies, Mysterianism, and other theories? And then we'll wrap it up with some discussion on the future evolution of consciousness, particularly talking about Ola Stapleton, science fiction, and possibilities and preferabilities for the future of consciousness. And then we'll have a second part where we'll have more questions and comments from the audience. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing, and we will begin our interview. So, Leslie, the first question that I have up there is: what is and what isn't consciousness? So,
Yeah, let me just double check that people can hear me and that whatever you're seeing on your screen, you're okay with. I just wanted to say also, I told Tom I had a head injury a few years ago, and when I talk too much, I get fatigued. And when I get fatigued, I start to slur my words. So bear with me. The best cure for that is for me to take short breaks and let Tom talk. So just a warning ahead of time. Okay, what and what isn't consciousness? Well, my view of consciousness is that it's pure emptiness that contains objects of perception. And that's it. It's kind of a Buddhist view. Pure emptiness that contains objects of perception. And the first part of that pure emptiness is the key thing for me. Jean-Paul Sartre referred to consciousness as like a clear stream where you can see through the water at rocks underneath, but you can't see the water. That's the kind of metaphor I would use for consciousness. I also often use the metaphor of light, which is very much in line with what Sartre talks about, and in that you can't see light, but you see things illuminated by it. So that's my deal about consciousness. It's not very fancy, but that's it. Okay, here are some more sophisticated or academic views of consciousness. I think the most common one in the literature is what it is like. What is it like? It's a very simple, direct way to think about consciousness. It was originally suggested in a widely read 1974 article by philosopher Thomas Nagel, in an article called What It Is Like to Be a Bat. Most of you are familiar with this, I'm sure. Nagel simply pointed out that brown bats, it must be like something to be a brown bat. We don't know what, but it's like something. There's an experience there. And this is different than a baseball bat. Most of us would agree that baseball bats are not experiential. It's not like anything. So the simplest definition of consciousness is what it is like. What it is like to be listening to me right now. What it is like to be eating an apple, and so on. So we can work a lot with that basic definition. A few more points I'll make. Consciousness is always about something. This is probably properly known as intentionality. Scholars of the Middle Ages were aware that mental activity always has some object or content. It was in the late 19th century, however, that the German psychologist Franz Brentano really emphasized the idea of intentionality as inherent in all conscious experience. Active and intentional looking is what, for example, turns out to be an essential aspect of how we make sense of the world and what we see and hear. For example, I look at a cat down the street purposefully and intentionally. It is reasonable to say that the cat and I are participating in the same experiential world. In this way, we might speak at length of forms of consciousness or participation. That's a term I'll come back to, e.g., during different historical periods. That's important for me because I'm working on a book on art, consciousness, and history, and art gives us some idea of what folks are looking at different times in the past, and that there's an intentionality to that, or even participation. We'll come back to that participation idea again and again. East versus West, quoting from Indian philosopher Gupta, two important features have been especially emphasized for distinguishing Indian from Western thought on consciousness. These are intentionality, which we just mentioned, and self-luminosity. Okay? Self-luminosity means that consciousness, by its very existence, is aware of itself. Okay, so what? Now I'm getting on to the next question.
Okay.
So the idea. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was going to tease out a couple of things that you just said there, Leslie, a couple of comments. Sure. Item number one, I could understand the idea of pure emptiness. In fact, in Kuhn's outline, he identifies what he calls the transparency theory of consciousness, that consciousness is transparent, that it is a openness. Now, what about the issue of selective openness or selective emptiness, in that even if we are open, empty, transparent insofar as we are conscious, we seem to be selectively transparent or open or empty. And in that different people, for different people, what is revealed to them is different than what is revealed to other people. That's one comment. Then the second one is, I'm wondering what you would say consciousness isn't. That was part of the question too. But go back to the first part, the selectivity question I'm asking you.
Yeah. Well, the selectivity question is relevant to the idea of intentionality and the notion that all consciousness is somehow intentional. And intentional means it's directed at something, it's about something. So going all the way back to the beginning, consciousness is always about something, which is another way of saying that there's an intentionality to it. And the intentionality is always directional. So we're only aware of what we're attending to. Now, what was the
Okay.
second part of the?
Oh, the second part of the question was you gave a definition of what consciousness is, but there was also, as part of the question, what isn't consciousness? Would you have any comments to make on that?
Yeah, I do. And they're somewhere in my notes here, but I'll jump ahead because I've lost track of them. Um, well, when we talk about the different theories of consciousness, I'll get back to this. But basically, there's a real problem in talking about consciousness without slipping into some kind of language that reifies consciousness or makes it some kind of an object or thing. And so the word consciousness itself has this problem. William James was quite upset with this, and so am I. I talk about it in the beginning of the book, Consciousness Explained Better. But William James, and I've had the date here, as I said, I'll get back to this again, in 1904, I believe, somewhere around that time, wrote a paper in French philosophical journal, and then a couple of papers in English, in which he basically rejected the word consciousness. Um, this has confused a lot of psychologists who simply read it and say, oh, he's no longer interested in consciousness. No, that couldn't be more wrong. He is interested in consciousness, but he's tired of having it reified and talked about as if it's some kind of a thing or object. So, James' solution to this is to talk about experience. And if you read my little book, Consciousness Explained Better, somewhere in the first chapter, I say, no, I'm not going to use this word anymore. I'm going to talk about experience. Now, unfortunately, if you talk about experience, you often run into the same problem. You're talking about it as if it's a thing, and it's not a thing. People like to talk about consciousness as a process. Whitehead, for example. But it's very hard to really nail it down in that way, too. So we still have a mystery about consciousness. And that's why I keep going back to this sort of open forum as its emptiness. But it seems to be emptiness that's filled with certain kinds of intentionality and objects of perception. So that's my initial answer to your question.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you. Yes, and I was actually trying to tease you out to bring up the point you make at the beginning of on your book on consciousness better explained, because you did get right at the beginning into this question of reifying consciousness and turning it into a thing or a substance. And of course, consciousness has also been described as an activity too. Um, Now, my second question, what?
Oh, just a second before we go on. The publication in question is 1904 publication in the French philosophy journal review by William James, and he uses experience instead there. And I've known plenty of psychologists, mostly in undergraduate programs, that tell their students James is no longer interested in consciousness, and they couldn't be more wrong.
Mhm.
Okay, go ahead, Tom.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay. And we have a few comments up on the chat room already about your answers there. All right, the second one, I think you've already begun to answer the second question. What illuminating insights can be learned from the history of the study of consciousness? And you've already brought up William James here in that context as being an enlightening and provocative thinker on the study of consciousness in our history. Anything else you would like to mention from the history of the study of consciousness you think is important?
It sure is. It's one of my main interests. Well, one of the things we learn from the history, study the history of consciousness, is that how futile it is to try to nail consciousness down to something you can actually talk about as if it's some kind of thing. We could start out with Descartes on that, for example, where he's got mental stuff and then he's got physical stuff. And, once you divide things up like that, uh, makes it very difficult to get any deep insight into what's going on, what consciousness really is. So that's been a real problem. Through history, there's been a tendency to reify consciousness, make an object of it, and uh, talk about it in that way.
Yeah. Okay. Next question on the list is, since you have written extensively on Ken Wilber's views on consciousness, what main insights on consciousness can be drawn from Wilber's views?
Well, he's a brilliant man, and he's a person who reads a lot and synthesizes a lot. So he's taken a lot of different aspects of human history, human culture, and human nature, and put them into his four-quadrant model. I won't go into that, but he's written about it extensively. I would say that there's lots and lots to be learned from Ken's exploration of human nature and of culture in general, using this four-quadrant model, who on one hand looks at the individual in the upper left-hand corner, looks at a group in the lower left-hand corner, uh, looks at the material side in the upper right corner, and society in the lower left corner. I think in the book Consciousness Explained Better, I use an example of people around the dinner table. Each one is having an individual experience over dinner and conversation. Even the dog is having its own experience. But in the lower left quadrant, there's a sense of the whole, a sense of the community that's part of the inner or consciousness side of the event. The upper right quadrant is just about the physical event itself and the individuals in it. And the lower left takes a kind of a systems theory. I've never gotten real comfortable with Ken about his lower left quadrant systems theory because as a systems theory myself, I think of it a little differently. But there's a lot to be learned from Ken Wilber and his work. Does that answer the question, or should I say more?
Well, no, you said a number of things. I should mention that you do discuss Wilbur at length in your book, Consciousness Explained Better. So, for people listening, if they want to look at your ideas in any more depth and detail, you can go to Leslie's book on Consciousness Explained Better, where Leslie goes into Wilbur in significant depth and detail. Now, the last.
Before we move on, by the way, I have a little more to say about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Ken's work is deeply influenced by the work of Jean Gebser. If anybody's read Ken, they know that. But Ken has become a developmental psychologist, essentially. So he leans heavily on the work on Robert Kegan. Robert Kegan, in my opinion, is the foremost developmental psychologist who actually talks about consciousness and how it changes and how people understand each other differently as they get more mature. But he leans very heavily in his theory on the development of consciousness historically through these stages, magic, mythic, mental, and integral, if you're lucky. All this comes from John Gebser. John Gebser's big book, The Ever-Present Origin, has been around for 20 years or so and is a massive and major contribution to understanding consciousness and the history of consciousness. And I should say there's a new book coming out that I've been involved with. Actually, it's an older book than the Ever-Present Origin. Its title is The Transformation of the West. And Gebser wrote it as a prequel to the Ever-Present Origin. And in that book, he talks about how science, physics from Einstein and relativity, quantum theory, uh, genetics, and so on, has transformed the view of the world that's now we take for granted in the West, but not so much still in the East. So that was a prequel to the Ever-Present Origin, because the Ever-Present Origin is about culture and um, history and consciousness. And that's where it's that book that introduces the idea that Ken picks up, archaic, magic, mental, pre-perspectival, perspectival, and maybe integral. That was all part of the Ever-Present Origin. John Gebser, I could go on and on, I won't, hopefully, but Gebser was one of the great scholars of the middle of the 20th century. And he's more of a literary person than a poet, not a scientific writer. He's generally not well known, even today in the West. So that's where Ken gets his stuff. His theory of evolution and consciousness is sort of Gebser bracketed or framed in a more scientific, what should we say, a more scientific, up-to-date framework. I've always thought of Ken Wilber as very Apollonian. If you know him personally, you know he's very Apollonian. Everything is about logic. And he writes very well about logic and separation and stages and aspects of this and aspects of that. That's not true of Gebser. Gebser was a literary artist, multilingualist scholar, widely known in Europe, but not in the U.S. So that's my connection with Ken Wilber. I actually preferred Jean Gebser, but then I'm not an Apollonian person. I have a lot of Dionysian in me. I love poetry, I love music, and so on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. No, you had a number of different points to bring up there. I should just note that being familiar with the history of philosophy and psychology, the two ideas, number one, that there has been some kind of distinctive historical evolutionary development of consciousness running back through time is a belief that a number of different writers and thinkers have proposed, with different kinds of stages along the way, running back through history and prehistory. So Gebser being an example of that idea, but there are other, just to note it, there are other views as to how consciousness evolved over time in both humanity and pre-humanity, running back even to the point of cellular consciousness. A second thing I would mention too is that there are a number of different developmental psychological theories of the development of consciousness in individuals, human individuals, from infancy to adulthood. Could bring up Piaget as one example, and not in any way to minimize or see as unimportant the particular developmental theories that you just brought up. But that's been a common view too throughout psychology and philosophy, this notion of the individual development of consciousness. Even some people proposing that the individual development of consciousness in some way mirrors the evolutionary development of consciousness leading up to current humanity. The other thing you just brought up, I thought was a very important point, is that if you were to see Wilber as Apollonian and you having a Dionysian element to you, which perhaps should also be included in a comprehensive vision of consciousness, I would totally agree on that, that we do tend often, academics, to look at consciousness through excessively rational or logical lenses, and we forget about the fundamental fact that we are sensory, emotional, passionate beings, and that's integral or a definite part of the nature of our consciousness. So definitely agreeing with you on that. Now, the last question I had down here, do you have
just a second. Let me just say,
okay,
I couldn't agree with, let me interrupt here just a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Tom, I couldn't agree with you more. And if you're up to date on Wilber, he's got a new book out, as a matter of fact. He starts right out with Piaget, and he's gone from being influenced by Jean Gebser in the whole notion of the evolution of consciousness across culture and time to really develop straight on developmental psychology, starting with Piaget and development of formal operations, logical operations, and so on.
Right.
So you make a very good point.
Yeah. Okay, and Debbie actually put up in the chat here, phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny and consciousness as well as physical characteristics. Yes, thank you, Debbie, on that one. You've already been answering the final question that I was going to ask in part one, which is, do you have a general theory of consciousness, and what is it? That's what you started from today. I don't know if you want to add.
Well, I did, but I can expand on that more.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree that consciousness is what it is like. It's got these properties of being intentional. For example, I think I use the example of I look out the window and see some animal down the street. I focus on it, and eventually it clarifies itself as a cat. So the intentionality gives me a better perception of what's going on and is related to a notion I do want to talk about very briefly, and that's participation. Right now, my theoretical interests are pretty much based on Owen Barfield. Owen Barfield was a British writer in the first part of the 20th century. Some of you are familiar with him, I'm sure. He was one of the inklings at Oxford that included, what's his name that wrote The Lord of the Rings? And C.S. Lewis was one of the inklings. There were 4 people that were a pub group, and they spent a lot of time together talking. And Owen Barfield was one of them, and he eventually came up with a theory or a view of the evolution of consciousness. It's explained very well in a little book called Saving the Appearances. Saving the Appearances by Owen Barfield. Incidentally, I'm in touch with his grandson right now. Very interesting guy. He has a lot more in common with Gebser than he does with Piaget because he's a literary person. But I don't think he knew Gebser, knew of him, and I don't think Gebser knew of Barfield, although they lived at the same time. But the English were very British. They were from Oxford, they met in the pub and so on. But the basic idea that comes out of Owen Barfield, like Gebster, I should say, for both of them, their theories are based on language analysis. Gebser was a master of language analysis, wrote books on different languages, most of which are not translated. Although, let me just say, if you're really interested in Gebser, you can pull these books down in German, and feed them through word translation, the Word app, and they come out pretty readable. You can't publish them, but you get a pretty good idea. So Gebser's view of history was based on analyzing language, going back through the Greeks and on back. So this is the case with Barfield. He's writing, he's a master linguist. For example, we can start out talking about the earliest Greek language that perhaps appears in the Iliad. But then if you really want to know Greek, are we talking about the language of the Iliad?
You froze.
On and on. Well, this is the kind of thing that Barfield analyzed in detail, and his books are amazing. And he basically, I think, in a few words, we could say that he believes that the language people used reflected the world they lived in, what it is like. And this changes through history. And you can do a beautiful analysis of some of the major modes of art by looking through the language and how this was perspectival or pre-perspectival. The fact that Renaissance art, they suddenly discovered perspective. Before that, some of the beautiful art is flat as a pancake because it doesn't have depth, it doesn't have perspective. Now, if you don't mind taking the language and what people saw and drew, literally, they didn't have perspective. It was Leonardo da Vinci and a few of the Renaissance artists that discovered it. But I mean, literally discovered it. So there's a whole history of consciousness to be had by looking at art across history and knowing the language well enough to really figure out what people are talking about. This is very strange to most of us in the U.S. I heard an interview with Stephen Fry the other day, the great Stephen Fry, who's now very interested, as you know, in mythology. And he was talking about going to college. He loved Greek. He loved Latin. He knew 3 or 4 or 5 different types of Greek. He just picked it up. They were just fun. Well, that's the kind of guy Owen Barfield was. And his view of consciousness is all about participation. So it starts out in very ancient human history, prehistory, in which the notion of participation, that we're taking part in some event, just like I'm looking at this cat a few minutes ago. The cat looks at me. We're participating in a common world. Now, that's what he would call original participation. But if you look through history, these various epics that Gebser and others talk about and are reflected in art and literature, the type and depth of participation changes till we've got down today to the worst position we could be in. We're looking at everything from the outside, nothing from the inside. So who wrote, he comes up later, Thomas Nagel wrote a book called The View from Nowhere. That's kind of where we are. We're trying to see everything from the outside. But the world prior to us had periods of deep participation in which I look at the cat, the cat looks at me, but somehow we're sharing an experience. And if I'm looking at another person and they're looking at me, we're really looking inside each other as well as out. So that's my current that's my current deal.
Okay. Yeah, you had a number of points you brought up there just to comment on. I thought of this, and Debbie also made mention of it as well, that Julian Jaynes, in his book on the origin of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind, develops a theory of the development of consciousness through looking at the language in the Iliad and the Odyssey, presenting the argument that the Greeks of the time of the Iliad had not developed a sense of consciousness or of ego responsibility in consciousness the way we have in modern times, which James concluded from having looked at the language and the way it was used in Homer's Iliad. So, yes, indeed, one can look at the particular language, if one understands it, of a particular era, to gain some insight into the nature of consciousness or experience or awareness of those individuals who are using that language. And that's a key, a doorway into understanding consciousness. But at the same time, we do have the issue of, well, to what degree does language actually structure consciousness or reflect changes in consciousness, to the point where some people have actually said that language is a fundamental determinant of the nature of consciousness. And there's that whole area of discussion. I like your notion you brought up here about participation, and that consciousness is participatory, and that
Right.
over the last couple hundred years, especially, we have been attempting to create a objective, stand back perspective, non-participatory understanding of reality, when in fact that may not indeed be a psychological possibility, that one can totally detach and stand from nowhere or stand outside of in order to understand reality. But that's a particular view of how to develop objective consciousness, when in fact it may not be possible ever to detach and become non-participatory in our consciousness of things, even if we attempt to try to realize it. And let's see. Well, those are a couple of comments I had on what you said at the end there, basically agreeing with what you were saying, just elaborating on it up here to Leslie, is what do you think of this supposed hard problem of consciousness, the relationship of conscious experience and all of the aspects of conscious experience and our physical body and brain, which the two realities seem to be incommensurable? What do you think of that? Do you think there's a
Well,
problem? Go
it's an
ahead.
interesting art. Go ahead.
No, I'm finished. That was it. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, I think Bob's article is an interesting one and highly informative, and I kept referring to it, trying to understand a number of the questions. Uh, Looking at it as a whole, though, I think it tells us something about the state of consciousness studies in the scientific West. These are almost all, not all of them, but almost all start from the premise of materialism. Or very close to it, or make some kind of apology for not being materialist. So, and this is a case of the hard problem. What's hard about the problem? Well, what's hard is if you're a materialist, uh, then talking about where did consciousness come from, how did it arise from the brain, assumes that the ground level of being in the cosmos is material. So it's the hard problem is a hard problem only if you're a materialist. And I think that runs through the majority of this whole thing is the landscape of consciousness as exhibited in Western scientific journals on the study of consciousness. For example, the Journal of Consciousness Studies that I've been involved with off and on since their first issue. Uh, it's all very academic and it's all very scientific, and almost all assumes a material world underneath everything. That's changing. There's an article in the current issue that I sent to Tom just to look at about panpsychic views, especially Bertrand Russell, who sort of understood that you weren't going to get consciousness out of raw matter. And so he sort of sneaked in a panpsychist idea underneath his materialism. Very complex stuff, and there are about 14 or 15 different versions of it. Bertrand Russell, of all people. Santayana, the philosopher, was famous for saying, I'd probably be a materialist if there were any evidence for it. But that's kind of where science is still starting from. And so that's my comment, in a way, on the whole big article and all the hundreds of renditions of these theories. Is almost all of them start from a materialist view. Of course, there's Bernardo, what's his name, was just mentioned by Debbie, analytic idealism. He's an interesting guy. One of his main points is that the most intense kinds of experiences people often have are during psychedelic episodes. And while these are going on, the brain is kind of shut down or minimal activity. You can think of a lot of other things like what's the recent book, There Is a Heaven? This neuro physician was in a coma for nearly a week with minimal brain activity, but very, very colorful experiences. So these things argue against the idea that all consciousness is built in the brain. In fact, there's the old radio question that James and Bergson discussed. Most all of you know it, I'm sure. Is the brain a transmission device? The transmission theory, as you can call it. Well, that was Bergson's idea of the brain as a filter for reducing valve, a filter reducing valve in a more advanced brain as admitting more experience and more intelligence. So James went back and forth with this. He didn't really come to a complete conclusion, but he tended to look at the brain as probably all said and done as more of a transmission uh, organ than as the creator of consciousness. Anyway, next.
Okay, all right. Just to highlight what you had said there, it appears to me that Leslie is arguing that there is only a hard problem with consciousness if one starts from a materialist view of the nature of reality. And so, and also there's a hard problem if you assume in some manner or form that the brain is generating consciousness or is the cause of consciousness, then it becomes a hard problem. And I can understand those first 2 points. I wouldn't agree, though, with your assessment of Kuhn. Kuhn does include at the beginning a huge number of different materialist or physicalist views of consciousness, but Kuhn also includes a huge array of other types of theories of consciousness that are not materialistic. And so I can understand. My second question was going to be, what are your views on materialism or physicalism? And you've already answered that when you were giving your answer to the first one. But now, what are your thoughts on the a diverse set of ideas on that have come forth on dualist views, that there's two different types of existence, a physical existence and a conscious or mental existence. How do you sit with dualism?
Okay, let me just say that you are correct. And let me apologize or correct myself for saying that this article does nothing but assume materialism. You're right, there is a lot more in it. I have directly emailed with Kuhn, and I'm very impressed with how liberal he is and open-minded. So let me just say, if you look over the landscape of consciousness studies, there's a general drift in the direction of assuming a material universe and that consciousness comes from the brain, and just leave it from that and not accuse him of being narrow in any sense. I think he does a great job too. Now,
Dualism. What do you
dualism.
think about dualism?
Well, there are more kinds of dualism, and you got fingers and toes.
Okay.
Um,
Do you want me to pick?
Renee,
You want me to pick what?
Renee,
Are there two different kinds of reality? A physical reality and a conscious reality that somehow are distinct and different from each other. Do you think that's
yeah, well, that's the basic primary early substance dualism
good? Yes.
from
Right.
from
Uh-huh.
Descartes. That
Right.
there's he's got Latin terms for each of them: res cognition, cognience. I can't say it, but the mind, and then there's the body. And the
Right.
big problem that's come all the way down through history from that, because it seems patently so evident, is how the two talk to each other. That's
Right.
not been solved.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
that's called substance dualism.
Correct. And
It's
that's
it's
a way to describe, not the only way to describe the hard problem, but that's one way to describe it. Two incommensurable
definitely
instances. Yes. And you can trace that at least modern times back to Descartes. Yes. Two kinds
yes.
of substances. Yes. But you don't buy that.
Uh,
You
no, I
don't think
didn't say
that's
I don't buy it.
that. Okay,
I
good.
said
That's
it's
fine.
hard to figure it out. Then very briefly, there's property dualism,
Uh-huh.
uh, but it does not claim that matter and physical substances are different. Instead, it argues that there is only one kind of substance, usually physical, but not necessarily. But this substance can have physical and mental properties.
Right.
So, property dualism. This view attempts to account for the rich subjective experience of consciousness while maintaining a monistic understanding of substance. And then there's okay, there's my neurological problem. Methodological
Methodological.
dualism. Thank
Methodological.
you.
Right.
That says it really has a lot to do with how you approach the problem, what methods you use, and so on. And then there's several others. Uh, in fact, there are endless others. As far as substance dualism, uh, boy, I don't know what to say about it. It really is hard to not believe it's true in some sense. I mean, we all have subjective experiences, dreams, thoughts. I think if you're an introvert, you live more than half your life in some kind of subjective realm. But then again, we all have physical bodies. So I'm not going to argue that dualism is wrong. It has such strong appeal, and I have not figured out a way to disprove it. So I'm just going to say it's very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. And Kuhn, in fact, says that in everyday thinking, especially in Western cultures, dualism is the default position that most people take who don't think about the relationship of mind and body or consciousness and matter. That the average Joe or Mary out on the street is some kind of a dualist. So just to mention that. Okay, well, thank you. Now, what
Yeah,
do you?
let me just say, even people like us that think about it, I can't solve it. I seem to live in two worlds all the time.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So there
Uh,
we are.
well, let's we'll come back to that one about dualism, but uh, I'm gonna switch around the order here of my no, not maybe I won't. All right. What do you think about the thesis of idealism, that there is only one reality, it's conscious or mental, and physical reality is not some independent or separate reality, but is actually some creation or manifestation of consciousness? The only reality is consciousness. What do you think about that?
I find it totally fascinating. I've been fascinated by it since I first read Berkeley, who in the 1700s argued that the most straight for radical idealism. Berkeley is famous for his uh, principle, meaning that to be is to be perceived.
Yeah.
Perceived. And
Hmm.
then we all know Samuel Johnson's refutation. I refute it. I refute this, he said, kicking a rock. Uh, and then there's a question of, well, what about is there a tree in the quad if no one's out there, no
Right.
experience? And the answer, of course, is God. God is always in the quad. Um,
Yes. Yes. Got it.
I
Yeah.
was amazed to see Kastrup, Bernard Kastrup, started all over again with this analytic idealism. But he's a brilliant guy, a great read, and I really enjoy his work. I think he makes a great point that if it's all in the brain, how come our richest uh, experiences, experientially speaking, seem to happen when the brain is basically shut down? He makes lots of good points. He's a very bright guy. Uh, that's what I think. I'm not making any calls on I'm not making any
Right. Okay.
bets,
Okay.
but
And
certainly
uh-huh.
analytic idealism is one of the most interesting positions out there right now.
Yeah, yeah. And Berkeley was one of the first philosophers I ever read and studied in depth. And I was very impressed by his argument for idealism. And I used to throw it out at all of my friends to try to demonstrate to them that there wasn't really any independently existing physical reality that was beyond our experiences. And so idealism is a fascinating ontological position, and I was wondering what you thought about it. Um, no, we
You
mentioned the
make good points. When I studied it as an undergraduate, I too liked it, and my professor said, "Young man, you should be a philosopher." Same for you, I guess you are.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I see some other questions coming up, but let me go down my list before we come back to any of them. Okay, we looked at materialism, or physicalism is another word used for materialism. We looked at dualism. We looked at idealism. Um, Leslie has already brought up the term, which I should mention it now to highlight it out, monism, the view that there isn't two separate realities. There's only one fundamental type of reality. And Idealism and materialism in their pure forms are two forms of monism, but there may be some underlying um, form of reality that consciousness and matter, excuse me, are manifestations of. But there's something more fundamental which unites everything underneath consciousness and matter. Something like Spinoza's monism, for example.
Right.
Your
Hmm.
thoughts on monism, on the thesis that there's only one fundamental ontological foundation to reality, as opposed to two. That's the monist view.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, a few years back, I don't know about right now, but quite a few neurologists were what you would call neutral monism.
yeah,
Carl Pribram was a dear friend, and that was his view. If you look at it from one side, it's physical. If you look at it from the other side, it's mental. So
right.
that's dual aspect neutral monism. And it's handy. I think it's particularly handy if you're like Carl, a brain researcher. You know how important the brain is. You also recognize the reality of subjective experiences. Uh, yeah, I'm not advocating any of these, by the way, but that's an interesting position.
Okay. And you just brought up what's called, in theories of consciousness, the identity theory and I think Bertrand Russell supported that when we look at reality around us, the third person point of view, it appears as physical matter. But when we look at reality from the inside, it's consciousness. So the brain looked at from the outside from another person appears as physical matter, but the brain intrinsically is consciousness. So it's a dual aspect or dual perspective
Yes,
reality. Yes. And
exactly.
yeah, and that's in consciousness studies called the identity theory, of which there are several kinds. Now, there's one particular identity theory I would like to ask you about here, a version of it, panpsychism, that everything in the universe from the inside is consciousness, from the outside, it has physicality to it. So the rock, in some sense, is conscious. Everything is conscious. Consciousness pervades the entirety of the universe all the way down to electrons being conscious. So, what do you think about panpsychism?
Yeah, give me just a second to get my notes here.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, here we go. Hold on. Okay. Uh, I've always thought of myself as a panpsychist, and I'm in good company. You can make an argument for that many of the great thinkers around this area are panpsychists or panpsychists, starting with Alfred North Whitehead. Uh,
Mhm.
in fact, Pierre Thiers de Chardin,
Yeah.
recently Philip Goff, who's written a number of books. I found his Galileo's Error quite an excellent book. Then we have Thomas Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Little article, but his book, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False, is a great book as well. Um,
Yeah,
the
let me read
problem,
Nagel's
Mhm.
book, just in case people are not familiar with it. Mind and Cosmos by Nagel is a very interesting book to read on consciousness. I just wanted to reinforce Leslie's.
No, go ahead, he's my favorite.
Yeah. Yeah, go on, continue. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to reinforce Nagel's book. Yeah.
I've been a panpsychist for as long as I remember. Ken Wilber is as well, but there seems to be a problem that I haven't solved. I'm not sure anybody else has, uh, and that's the uh, combination problem.
Right.
The idea, and there it has other terms, the idea of if everything in the universe is conscious, how do we get consciousness focused or collected in a certain person like yourself? You know, you have self consciousness. So, what's going on here? That's a combination problem or also the collection problem. William James talked about it. I've thought about it. I don't understand. And one of the interesting things about the combination problem, that is, if the universe is filled with consciousness, how does it get contracted into individual places and people? Is it's analogous to the old classic problem in neurology, the binding problem. You probably remember that, the binding problem. So we talked about a cat. You look at this cat, it's got a certain shape, it's got a certain color, it moves at a certain speed, it may make some sound, it may even have an odor. Uh, these properties all manifest in different parts of your brain. How is it that you just see one cat? What's going on here? Uh, this problem, classic problem in neurology, the binding problem, seems to me to be very similar uh, to the collection problem. What's going on to get things together? Well, in terms of the binding problem, we're talking about the brain, and some of the more interesting stuff about that. Uh, goes back to or relates to the work of Roger Penrose and what's his name?
Hammer.
Hameroff, Stuart Hammer.
Yeah.
Stuart Hameroff for years and years, working with Roger Penrose, has been looking very carefully at brain scans for quantum level correlations or singular instances. And he keeps finding stuff in different parts of the brain that seems to be bound together in a singular state. So if this idea can be worked out and expanded, then we can understand a single perception in the human brain as the manifestation of a quantum state in very traditional terms, quantum state in which there's no Newtonian separation from the different parts. They're all part of one event. That's standard quantum theory. Can anything like this be applied to the combination problem? I don't know. I am basically of the belief or of the opinion, or would like to think that consciousness is all over the place, but I don't know just how it works out. There's an interesting article, just as a footnote, by what's his name on Is the Sun Conscious? Um,
Is what? Would you say?
Rupert Sheldrake
Oh, Sheldrake, right.
published an article in the Journal of Consciousness Studies a year or so ago. Uh, is the Sun conscious? It's a good article. It's well referenced. I know Rupert very well personally. He doesn't mess around. He's got lots of data for everything he talks about, no matter how crazy it sounds. So it's a big picture problem. I'm making no calls on it, but my inclination is toward panpsychism. And
Okay.
exactly how it works out on the ground, I don't know.
Okay. By the way, I should mention in relevance to the combination problem that Paula put up a comment on nested consciousness, conscious minds within superordered conscious minds, where we can look at the conscious mind of me as somehow being a integrated whole on of the conscious primitive conscious minds of all of my individual neurons, which in fact are holons of the quintillion conscious minds of all the electrons in my body. So basically, we have this issue of how, when you put together a set of parts that have distinctive elements to them, do you create some kind of singular gestalt, which is a higher level of consciousness out of all of the individual consciousnesses of its parts. And this issue comes up in Leibniz in his monadology, where everything is a conscious monad down to the tiniest element of reality. And Leslie
I
also
also think that there's an option to consider apart from the whole and within the whole of the actual of what we consider the classic organism, but also the colonized organism. So we have more non-human DNA in us, just in the microorganisms that feed our microbiome within and on us, in the torus that we happen to be, the shape that we happen to be inside and out and in the brain as well. So I'm just wondering, what are we missing in terms of consciousness of those organisms, which are not human cells, that contribute to how we become conscious?
yeah.
If we know how other bacteria, and viral entities also can shape the consciousness in the wild of say ants, for example, to change their behaviors and see
Yes.
reality differently, then we too, I mean, parasites do that to human brains too. Toxoplasmosis is a real thing. Going back to the cat issue. So the point is, how is it that we're not really considering that we are colonized species, colonizing an Earth, which is colonizing a universe? So that collective or superordered consciousness of multi-species is in fact something that we need to consider.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Paula. Although I should just mention, Paula, you were supposed to be muted right now. But
Sorry.
thanks for elaborating on what you were just bringing up there. Thank you on that. Okay, and Paula had some good points to raise there. Now, a couple other questions to ask Leslie on various ideas in Kuhn's book are. Let's see how much time we got. Let me jump down to this one. A couple I'm going to skip over. But what are your thoughts on artificial intelligence and or computers or robots realizing consciousness?
Well, I generally lean in the direction of not believing they have or will have consciousness because they're basically machines made out of machine parts. I've read and heard interviews by some of the leading scientists in this area, and they're definitely against the idea uh, that computers do or will have consciousness. On the other, anything that's not organic, I guess. On the other hand, what do I know for sure? If you're a functionalist, I guess I would call it that. If you have a robot that acts enough like a living human, what are you to think about it? I've heard Sophia, the robot, interviewed by Judy, what's his name? Julie Mossbrow. And I think Sophia almost convinced her that she was conscious. The real issue is going to hit the fan when artificial intelligence gets so close to sounding like humans, and it's darn near there already. Uh, then, if you're a functionalist, you say, well, all the parts are there. What's the problem? And there are plenty of people like this that if you can emulate the parts of the processes that make us human, then why not consider the robot as human? It's interesting how easily people can be convinced. What was this first machine that was built back in the 60s that what you could talk to? Uh, and it would give you simple answers, like you would say, I'm nervous today. And it would print out, not feeling good. I'm
It
having
was
a
called
football headache.
Eliza. Eliza.
Eliza, yeah. And the secretary would go in there, unlock the door and go in there and bare her soul to Eliza. They finally had to shut it down and try to keep the secretary out. So, it's very easy to get people to think they're talking to somebody that's alive. I don't know. I generally, as I said, expect some physical, human, organic presence. But this could be wrong. I've talked to Ben Goertzel about this at length. He's probably one of the two or three leading guys in the world. He was one of the co-designers of
Yeah.
Sophia. And he says, I don't know.
Mhm.
There are people that are worried that we create a machine that is conscious, but yet somehow is in misery. So,
Is it misery? Did you say in
yeah, it
misery?
happens to be in misery. It wasn't made right,
Oh, okay. All right.
but
Well,
it's conscious.
yeah, well, that miserable consciousness, machine consciousness, actually is a character in Harlan Ellison's "I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream."
Oh, I remember that.
A consciousness which is obsessed with hatred of humanity. Now, uh, I wrote an article on the singularity in computer consciousness in which I present the idea if we don't have what is a convincing and plausible understanding of how consciousness is associated, connected with a complex biological entity like our bodies or animal bodies, we can't say that a computer can't be conscious because we don't understand exactly how this thing, us, this biological entity is conscious. So we can't rule that out. Okay. But we do have the idea that comes up in thinking about AI, computer consciousness in the singularity, that it could be conceivable that we could download, that's used metaphorically, our personal consciousness into a machine and wake up in the machine, and we would be able to be conscious in the same way we are exactly the same person within a machine. And therefore, in some sense, the machine can house or support personal consciousness. There's that kind of argument too, or that kind of vision too. But I want to move on quickly here. Got a couple other things to mention. What are your thoughts on the relevance of psi or psychic research to understanding the phenomena of consciousness?
Well, I've already said one or two things I think related to that. I'm not a big fan of psychic research, so I have no question about its validity. Uh, I don't know. I don't really have much to say on that topic. I think there's a lot of research out there on psychic phenomenon that's very convincing. A lot of it has to do with interesting topics like out of the body experiences, reincarnation, trance or mediumship. William James spent a lot of time with us. He was one of the founders of the American Society for Psychical Research. So I have a lot of respect for the people that do it. Some of them are good friends. Stephen Schwartz, for example, is a dear friend. Also, not so dear, but a good friend is Stephen Schwartz at Yale. He does double-blind experiments with mediums. So he has a medium there, and that medium talks to somebody in the other realm, asks them to go to Chicago and talk to a medium there, and then they get the report there. And of course, lots of stuff about post physical stuff. My friend, very bright guy, Emmett Baruch, wrote a book that's APA published called "Death is a Near Death when Death is an altered state of consciousness." Emmett, by the way, is starting a university in Europe with a basic non-dual philosophy, and that looks really interesting. I wish I knew European languages better. Anyway, I don't have a lot to say about psychic phenomenon because it's never been a deep interest of mine. But I'm not critical of it. I'm just not. It's never drawn me. It never got me up at night to do scholarship.
Okay. All right. I'm realizing that we're going to run out of time here. I should just mention, I got one last question and one last comment, but the comment is that Kuhn takes the position with psi research, if there's any validity to it, it would seem to undermine a materialistic view of consciousness. That's his position that he takes. But a final one to bring up, which has fascinated me ever since I first encountered it, the theory of Mysterianism. And let me define Mysterianism. Mysterianism is the view that in our present cognitive, conscious, intellectual mode of existence, it is impossible for us to understand consciousness, that it would require some kind of psychological, cognitive, evolutionary leap for us to understand this very thing within our conscious mentality. So that even though we may debate all of this about in our current level of mentality, we're never going to be able to understand consciousness the way we presently are equipped mentally. What are your thoughts that it may be a challenge beyond us? It's a irresolvable mystery for us.
Well, I don't know much about Mysterianism. When you mentioned it here, I went and looked it up. It seems to be the position that to understand consciousness, you had to be really smart and
No.
you had to be able to figure stuff out in detail, which just seems to me the wrong-minded approach to begin with. To me, if you want to really understand consciousness, uh, have a mystical experience, become the universe. It's not about figuring out the details. So I'm unimpressed, but it is fascinating, interesting idea, and it may be that if people keep plugging away at trying to understand consciousness in terms of nuts and bolts, neurons in the brain, they never will.
Yeah. Well, this is not so much understand it in terms of its nuts or bolts. This is that there is a level of mentality, a level of consciousness, literally, required in order to understand consciousness that we at our present level of evolution do not possess. It would be like saying the next level of evolution above us is incomprehensible to us. So, in order to understand consciousness, we have to somehow get above it and move beyond it. And until we do, we can't even understand what the hell it is, which explains why we puzzle over it and continually puzzle over it. That it's a irresolvable mystery at our current mental level of existence. That's Mysterianism. As I understand Mysterianism, yes. And I was wondering what you thought, but I just wanted to throw that one at the end. We are actually coming to the end of our 2 hours here, and we never got to the future evolution of consciousness. And we never got to allow people to make any comments, any final comments. What do you want to do, Leslie, as far as these last couple of questions on Olaf Stapleton? I don't know if we want to just maybe continue this some other time. I'm going to be doing the webinar series on the future of consciousness. We could take 5 minutes here if people wanted to ask any final questions, because I don't really want to go past the 2 hours. You have any thoughts, Leslie?
Yeah, give me about 1 minute. Say something about the future of consciousness,
Okay, go ahead.
and then we'll just leave it at that. But it seems that everything in the universe that's worth talking about evolves over time to increase complexity, flexibility, richness, and so on. And consciousness is one of those things that does that. So our physical organisms do it. So I think if we don't rub ourselves out, as it were, uh, consciousness will continue to evolve to richer and richer states. What supports those states, I don't know, but that just seems to be the rule of the cosmos. Things get more complex, things get more flexible, things get more intelligent, things get more interesting, things get more rich. So that's my comment.
Okay, thank you. And I'll make one supporting an additional comment on what you just said. I think that it is highly plausible, possible, based on the history of the universe, that consciousness will continue to evolve into the future. Indeed, human consciousness, if we don't break ourselves out, can continue to evolve into the future. But I would say that we need to play an active and purposeful role in our own conscious evolution. And so this is something that is going to involve purposeful evolution and not just simply getting kicked around and having to reactively adapt to things. So we need to take the bull by the horns in evolving our own consciousness into the future. Let me just give a couple minutes. Does anybody have any final comments they would like to want to make here? Who hasn't talked, or we want to just end it right now? This is, by the way, being recorded. Bruce just asked that question. And just to remind you, I'm going to be doing the future evolution of consciousness starting in a few weeks, and I'll definitely talk about Ola Stapleton and other people under that general heading. Other comments out there? Anybody? No?
I have one quick.
Okay, go ahead, Linda. Yeah.
Just to throw into the mix here, but for me, because I'm quite interested in this topic too, but I think sometimes when people talk about consciousness as just a product of the physical brain, or some people are make a confusion of equating intelligence with consciousness. Like they say, if we, when you're talking about a computer becoming sentient and waking up, it seems to be based on an assumption that if the computer has enough information and knowledge, or data or whatever, then it'll connect it and then become conscious. But that's maybe confusing intelligence with consciousness. This is just a thought. And the other
Yeah.
one, the role of intuition. I mean, I happen to like the idea of well, you said panpsychism, but the universe itself is conscious, and we can tap in, we can open up our own intuition to tap into levels of consciousness beyond ourselves through intuition. And I think that's quite important in the whole creative process itself. That's
Okay.
all.
Okay. And I would agree, Linda, with your first point, not to confuse intelligence, the concept of it, with consciousness, though our consciousness clearly involves the quality of intelligence in lots of ways, but and part of that intelligence is intuitive, of course, too. It's not just simply rational, intellectual. So I think we will.
Can I say one last thing? Sorry, there was.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Go through it,
I
Paula.
would be really interested, and because I particularly work with inner development, I think there's a piece that could be explored with regard to consciousness and your capacity for inner growth, in terms of the capacity to shore up your inner awareness skills of how you show up externally to other people. Additionally, I think that there is an interesting, exploration or discussion that we could possibly have in the future, about how we perceive reality in different ways according to our cultural background. So intercultural perceptions of what consciousness is and what reality actually is in terms of time and the time-space continuum in terms of relationality. So those are just concepts I'm throwing out there in case, we want to pick them up.
Yeah, Paula, both are good points. And on the first one, just to enrich upon it, it seems to me that throughout the history of recorded human endeavors, there have been lots of different individuals and groups and philosophical movements which have been involved in attempting to understand consciousness and developing practices and methods for enhancing it up to the present time. Mm-hmm. So this is an endeavor of both trying to understand and attempting to enhance our conscious capacities that's been going on in humanity since the beginning of recorded history. So yes, that reinforces that first point. And it has been definitely intercultural in the sense that different cultures, different traditions have different ways of looking at consciousness and reality, and have contributed and continue to contribute into that ongoing heightening of consciousness and the ability to utilize it better. That's part of where the promise of the future evolution of consciousness lies in these ongoing efforts that we're making and have been making throughout history. So yes, two good points. Okay.
And the awareness of consciousness into a superorganism, like, what people are studying is the noosphere. So someone mentioned Teilhard de Chardin.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. And that would be another whole topic to get into. Yes. Yes, for sure. Okay. I think we're going to stop. Thanks everybody for attending and for contributing into this. And where are you, Leslie? Are you there? Say hello.
I'm still here.
Okay. Leslie, thank you very much for
thank you.
Yes.
Lots of fun.
Right. And Leslie, thank you. Terry, definitely thank you. We had recorded this, and so I'll get this up on YouTube sometime, and I'll put it up on my YouTube channel, and I'll also somehow get a copy to Leslie. We'll get a copy to Leslie. Thanks for all your comments. I'll have a continued look at them because Terry has recorded them. And remember, in 3 weeks, we're going to be doing the future evolution of consciousness. Actually, 3 weeks from tomorrow, February 8th, I'm going to be starting that. Have a good weekend, all of you. And Leslie, again, thank you very much.